Welcome everybody. Just a little bit about myself. I guess I wrote my first line of code somewhere around 1982. Today I am a founding member and CTO of Dariel, and I still write code. I find it's a place that keeps my mind most occupied. It's the place that makes me question what value we're actually delivering, and it's the place that grounds me. So, my topic, an Agile Architecture. Is there such a thing? Whoops. The approach we're going to take is attempt a little bit of a definition. Or some questions regarding change. I think Agile is about change and responsiveness. Consider the human factor. Consider a couple of problems and solutions. And consider customer value, and then perhaps try and redefine. So, recent forays, I guess, of my journey reveal a whole lot of titles, terms, things around architecture. One will see these in all your standard corporates. And the question is, what then, based on this, is Agile Architecture? My own personal journey having come through from software development itself, being very technical, all the way through to today what is termed enterprise architecture. Is a bit of a dirty word to me. Maybe purely because it revolves itself around governance as opposed to delivering of real value. And thinking, what role then is architecture playing within the Agile world? So, is it just that, plus all the other buzzwords that you'll hear or learn of today in terms of the normal Scrum, Kanban, Scrum, Lean, Safe, etc.? Always Agile Architecture something more than that. I'd hope to see by the end of the presentation that it's certainly a lot more than that. The question we actually have to ask in terms of change is what is appropriate? When is an Agile Architecture appropriate? Now, a couple of the graph I have here, a couple of figures I have here is essentially the budgetary spend per industry sector according to CEB as a percentage of turnover. So what we're noticing here is that there are some companies on the far left there which essentially spend quite a bit of money on IT and IT transformation. Why are those businesses so different to anything on the right? And it all comes down to the degree of digitization and the degree of change in each of those industries. For example, if you take a construction company, a place that builds bridges, one deal lasts for 3 years before you have to re-engage with another customer. Having looked at something like a more digital business, like a Netflix or something like that, or high-tech industry, one deal for one customer is a matter of seconds. Your need for speed, your need to be faster, quicker, more responsive is very definitely linked to the kind of industry you're actually servicing as an architect. So does it make sense, for example, to start a digital channel in a construction company? No. Your customers are parastatals and other big businesses. Another thing, another fundamental is that this, to me, is a simplified version of what is TOGAF's enterprise continuum, that there's this constant interaction between business strategy and architecture itself, where the one informs the other in a continuous circle. Yet fundamentally, our technical solutions exist for one thing and for one thing only, and that is to service the bottom line. Business fundamentally drives architecture and technology itself. So in Agile business, a high rate of change implies the need for an Agile technology architecture. One of the rules, or a number of the laws that I subscribe to or like to view, and the one that sticks out really in this case is Conway's. Organizations design systems which copy the organization. What does that essentially mean? That essentially means that your systems are only going to be as good as the configuration of your entire enterprise and the communication channels that are actually set up within that enterprise. Another way of looking at that is that business tends to get the systems that they ask for. They might have asked for the wrong thing, but they got what they asked for. What about change cost? Now, I owe some of this thinking to Yuval Lowy, who's more of a Microsoft evangelist, but he thinks about cost of change in terms of two dimensions or two factors. One is the cost of synthesis, the cost to build something new. The second is the cost of analysis, the cost to later on figure out how it was built and why it works the way it does. I think as architects, most of us spend time minimizing the cost of synthesis, the build costs, and very little time minimizing the cost of analysis. Yet we all know that software spends so much more time in production than in its construction phases. Maybe 10 to 15 years more time. What we also know is coming in to figure out someone else's system 3 or 4 years down the line is one hell of a costly exercise. So what should our architecture reflect and which cost should we actually be optimizing? A lot of our generative frameworks that we use today, for example, try to optimize cost of synthesis. How fast can I build this? Not how fast can I understand this? What about flexibility and change? And this is an old thing. Business always asks. You ask them for example, non-functional requirements. What must this system be? It must be flexible. In response, what does IT do or what does the architect do? He builds configurability. In configurability, you create your own complexity. Once you begin leveraging that configurability by adding configuration or variances of scenarios, all of a sudden your problem space to test increases at m by n complexity. And you end up where you began. The more business variables we inject into things like rules engines, into things like scenario players, the more complicated they become. And we end up where we began. Business changes become slow. Why? Because we now have to retrogressively test every single configuration that pre-existed the most recent one. Let's think a little bit about people. And what does an agile architecture mean for people, particularly technical resources on your project? And how do we contain or what I call manage that cost of learning that occurs in every person's head? And to do that, we actually need to understand how people understand and learn things. In this theory of what is now termed cognitive load, there are essentially 3 parts involved in you understanding something that you've never seen before. The first is the intrinsic cognitive load. That's based on the natural complexity of a problem space. For example, learning something about retail sales may be a lot easier than understanding how to automatically assess a medical aid claim. Those are 2 very different intrinsic cognitive loads. Second type, germane cognitive load. That's essentially imposed by your own brain on how you arrange the information in your head as you learn it. So that's when you start to draw on the metaphors and you put the information coming into your mind into categories. Categories that make sense to you and how you want to understand this piece of system. The third type, extraneous cognitive load. And that's based on how it's taught. I'm sure many of you have faced a wretched school teacher versus a really good one who can inspire you. The subject matter is exactly the same, but the style of the teacher can make you learn learn the knowledge a lot faster, with a lot more enthusiasm. So when we look at architectures, we've got to understand just what the cognitive load is going to be on the individuals coming into the project and leaving the project through the life cycle of that endeavor. Any kind of architecture which has a 4-month ramp up, can you consider that essentially agile? I'm not so sure. 4-month ramp up, new staff member before he's effective. Maybe too complex, maybe too abstract. So a little bit about solutioning. And if we are to follow business, then we have to observe what business is doing around us. When any business starts, the natural pattern is that a lot of activities, roles, responsibilities, capabilities, call them what you may, overlap massively. And that's purely a human resource kind of a problem. You're a startup company of 3 people, someone has to do HR. What happens over time? Over time, the specialities or the capabilities move apart, right into their own departments. And the same thing occurs with the systems that support those capabilities. So my very simple example here, you've got a separate payroll system, a separate CRM. So the nature of business to face the problems of scale is essentially to specialize, to drive out specialization so they can identify and clarify roles and responsibilities far better. So a little bit into the defining. Is agile architecture then enabling the rate of change, or is it mitigating the consequences of change? Right, for a thing to be responsive, for it to be agile, it has to have a low cost of change. The truth is, I believe it is both. You've both got to enable the business to change quickly, as well as to mitigate the consequences of those changes, meaning the breaking changes, those things that worry us all as technical people. One view on change resistance, an idea taken from a very old piece of work, The Big Ball of Mud. I don't know how many have read it, of you have read that. But essentially they talk about what are called lines of tension or fissure lines. Now for those of you who remember anything from your geology, what happens when 2 tectonic plates want to move in opposite directions? Essentially there's a buildup of pressure, and at some point when the pressure is released, an earthquake occurs and everything breaks. Software is similar. There exists within software and between software components lines of fragility where too much overlap happens. What has been the natural tendency? Specialization, the moving apart, the application of things like abstraction, the words like decoupling and interfaces, essentially allowing the pieces to move apart. So what do we notice here? What we notice is that for a long time, a number of what I would call product vendors have essentially been getting things wrong, trying to build the all-purpose, all-encompassing ERP that will solve absolutely every single problem. I don't believe that that is an agile approach. I talked about specialization. On the other side, what do we have? We have abstraction, the creation of layers. Now, if there are any software devs out there who've essentially experienced something rather interesting, is that with the onset of something like object orientation came the idea that most components should be deeply abstracted. I don't know how many people have actually dealt with or had active experience on a system with an incredibly deep abstraction or class hierarchy layer. The problem you face in cognitive load of understanding just what such a system is going to do is immense. So neither can we abstract too much, and when is a face no longer a face? talking a little bit about integration. If you're working on any size system of significant size, we essentially have old-fashioned integration problems. This is simple hello world translated into many languages. And the purple layer you see is what we call the translation layer, essentially where abstractions leak from one domain into another. The question is, what happens when we add a fifth system to the order of complexity of the problem that we are faced and the change knock-on effects? Essentially, what we can see is that mathematically, this is an m by n order complexity problem. Changing one component in this scenario breaks all others. Can that be considered agile? Highly unlikely. High cost of change. So what do we do to solve problems like this? To solve problems like this, we use patterns or best practice. This is the age-old middleware, translation complexity being isolated to the middleware. And we have our nodes on the outside intercommunicating. Notice that we move what was essentially the leaky abstraction translation layers from the outside into the middle. When we add the fifth node, what changes? Oh, went too far. Hardly anything. We reduce the complexity of the problem to an n plus 1. Okay, so that's all very nice and pretty in a hello world simple scenario. What about real life? Can we apply this thinking to real life? So those of you who are familiar with the newer ways of doing business analysis in terms of customer journey analysis, etc., as opposed to user story or user scenario, will come to understand that a customer journey is nothing but a sequence of events. Events are things that happen in the life of your customer. So what I have here is essentially, let's call it large banking enterprise kind of example, where we have a number of divisions on the outside, each expressing their interest in a particular event. Corporate investment basically tells the middleware, I don't really care about customer marital status changes. Card division says, I'm interested in customer marital status changes. The same is true for store and for fiduciary. For those who don't know what fiduciary is, this is basically the part of the bank that deals with wills and estates. Now, where's the natural place that an event such as this one actually emerges? Most likely in life policies. When you get married, you add a new beneficiary or you add another life to be covered onto that policy. So notice how the event emerges out of life policy. Nao got married. This is her husband. Notice also that life policies did not direct this message at any particular subsystem out there. Nao got married. This is her husband. The message propagated towards card division. Nao just got married. Can I offer her a second card? The message propagated to the store. Nao just got married. Can I remind her of a gift special? The message propagated to fiduciary. This is the obvious one. Nao just got married. Can I contact her to change her will? So this undirected, event-driven based way can lead to masses of flexibility. It can also lead to the ability of the outside systems to change very quickly without affecting any other source or target system. This must be part of an agile architecture. So let's ask the question about value. I mean, right Agile is everything about customer value. What's the customer value out of all of this? Now, we have this age-old problem between the customer on the left and his sentiment, what he's trying to purchase that's of value to him, as well as a myriad of roles, systems, and responsibilities behind the scene, behind the front desk, behind the branch, somewhere in that enterprise and in that organization. How many of you have faced a situation where you've made an application for something? It could be car insurance, it could be due bond, and have absolutely no clue, once you've thrown it into that business, where your application actually is. You phone the contact center, they don't know. Phone the call center, they don't know. You try the online portal, it can't show you. The problem we have there is essentially one of empowerment. And what an Agile architecture has to do is to empower the user to answer those questions of the customer. And how I see that is by creating a cognitive field, the ability to answer, where is my application? Why is it stuck in let's say, payment? And who is taking care of my business? How do we respond to that? We respond by applying principles like orchestration. However, as a controversial topic or state management across multiple complex systems, these days one considers that the process engine is nothing more than just another listener to events. Why would you do that? Why would you make the BPM or the IBPM? I don't know if any of you are familiar with intelligent business process management type tools that measure and tell you how fast your processes are running, where things are stuck. Why would we turn a central system like that into nothing more than just a listener? The problem all comes down to, once again, change. For those of you who are in the technical field and have faced the change obstructions of getting a new orchestration deployed onto the centralized ESB, there is no ways your business can respond with the speed with which that kind of change occurs. Does it ring true with anyone to submit something to the ESB department? Sorry, we can't deal with this. We're on a monthly release cycle. They don't give a damn that you as virtual channel are on a weekly release cycle. Two different rates of change coming up against each other. So, to summarize, my view on what an Agile architecture actually is. It allows the business to flex over the long term by enabling change at a reasonable rate and cost. With that, I think it's also wrong to assume that all parts of a business change at the same rate. Once again, if you consider that all parts of a business change at the same rate, it would mean that the central system that shall rule them all would then only change as the slowest part. So things need to move apart. The Agile architecture overcomes cognitive load. Now, these are the difficult ones, because it's got to be simple enough to understand, but not too simple. Where does the not too simple part come in? With oversimplification, you face the problems of not being able to extend. However, once again, with over-abstraction, you face the problem of not being able to understand. So, the Agile architecture has abstraction, but not too much abstraction, just enough to be valuable. The Agile architecture is decentralized, and it's heavily event-based. Why do we need the events? We need the events to ensure that different components or different parts of the Agile architecture can change at different rates. Finally, the Agile architecture empowers the end user to service the customer. We have to think in our head of business value and empowering our user base in order to answer those critical customer questions. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it.
Thank you, Wayne. That was brilliant. We have just a minute. Maybe we'll take 2 questions. Right. Any 2 burning questions or comments? Anybody? Really? Okay, we have one at the back there.
Could you perhaps, is it on? Oh, sorry, I got flu. So how would you recommend approaching this to management if they have their own compliance factors, opening up the channel for them to possibly consider, not being too stringent with policies?
So you're talking really about the governance side of architecture itself? None of this, I believe, violates governance to any degree. What this really is about is about critical thinking. It's about thinking about what is valuable. It's about thinking about how do I manage cost for the company? How do I manage cost for the management itself? Because no change is for free. My job as an architect or as a developer with other skills is to ensure that those changes are committed at minimum cost and minimum risk. So management itself, I think they do understand that in order to scale, specialization must occur. Things must move apart. What they've been sold, I'm not sure whether through popular culture or popular marketing, is that there is the one solution that will solve all their problems. Does that answer your question?
Cool. Let's give it up for Wayne one more time.